Ooh.
Are we live?
I think so.
Even I think so. But here, okay. Done redirecting to Facebook Live page. And yes, we are live. So, hi, hello everyone. Today we have Abhijit with us. Once again, Abhijit with us. And after last conversation, everyone is really curious to know what are we going to do today. So today Abhijit is going to talk about history of education, though it looks like a boring topic to after listening to this title. But this is an interactive session where he is bringing so many stories and so many things in front of us. So without taking much of your time, I'm over to you, Abhijit.
Thank you. Yeah, I think every time I have come across the history of education of any place, it sounds it has been boring lectures or a lot of reading material. On the other hand, I think I learned more about the history of especially Indian education through conversations, through listening to people, through understanding assumptions and thoughts. So I like to keep it conversational. Disclaimer: I'm not a historian. I work with communities. I'm interested in history because it informs actually why a system is the way it is. Most people
Yes.
try to solve problems because a system or a method is not working. But for me, it is important to know why it doesn't work or what causes it to work in a certain way. And I think the history of Indian education was a really eye-opening one for me, where when I created this self-learning space back in 2014, I couldn't understand how is it that people can learn by themselves, whereas uh, all our lives we've been taught that you have to go to school to learn, you need teachers to teach you, you need a system, and then actually that was not a necessary case. That is only what we see around us today. So understanding the history of Indian education and then we did a lot of projects in Africa, and understanding how education works in certain parts of Africa and what was their history made us realize a lot of things about education and about the colonial nature of education systems that exist in most countries that were colonized before. So uh, I think what I would like to start with is a certain grounding. I would like to know from the participants here or on Facebook Live, where do they think the Indian schools come from? The schools that you see around you, when do you think they started? And where does it come from? What is the origin of these schools that we see today? Right. So what do you know basically about the history of education? And then we will start from there, build up a conversation as opposed to a lecture. So you can use chats. You can also write in the, basically on various chats that are available to you. And just comment saying where do you think education comes from? Oh, I already have one answer. Religious education that was imparted in the Gurukuls and temples. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you, Shreya. Let's have some more answers. Let's have some more, and then we will look at these answers,
Yeah.
and we will try to see, what's happening with them. Maybe the Britishers introduced the current system. It's a guess. Okay. Okay. Let's have some more. Take a wild guess. No problem.
Yeah. Modern education it started from colonial times, British.
Thank you, Rishikesh.
Others, please write. take a part.
Could you also paste any comments that are put on the Facebook Live? So I
Yeah, I'm just checking that. Yeah.
could you also paste any comments that are put on the Facebook Live? So
Yeah.
History is the document of past. Yes, it is. No doubt. That is what it. That is why it becomes very important to understand. It helps
Yeah.
us to understand the intention behind something, right? Because when we see something today or in the present, we can't see the intention behind it. We can only see its existence. So history helps us understand the intention. Oh, there's 18 participants here on Zoom. Guys, come on, put your thoughts.
At
Uh,
least, yeah, at least yet they haven't posted anything on Facebook, but here people can write.
like you mentioned, colonialism brought with a lot of Eurocentric notions like education to places like India that have been colonized before. Very good. Pre-independence government introduced education system where there were a need of workers. Interesting. Good. All right. One more minute and then
Yeah.
I'll start talking about these things. Yeah. Come on, guys. Put whatever comes to your mind. Whatever. Just put it. When I was a kid, or even actually all the way till college, I thought, more or less, this is what education has been for almost ever, right? That it has been just changing slightly over time, over a long number of years, and then I was proven wrong.
Can you please share the question?
Where is that?
Somebody is asking that here. Can you please?
So the
Yeah,
question is simple. Where do you think Indian education
comes
comes
from.
from, right? So, and that is if you're from India. If you're not from India, then you can talk about your place or your country. All that is fine. But we're talking about the current model, the
Yeah,
schools that you see today.
yeah.
Yeah. So just keep that in mind. Religion and caste are two main reasons for the current education system. Okay, good. Current system is due to colonial rule. Good. Okay, we are at 4:15, so I'll try to pick up these answers.
Yeah.
So I think there's one more. British introduced the modern education system so that they can communicate with Indian people better and do business. That's right. So let's start with where this model of centralized teaching comes from, right? So for one thing to understand is that learning is a biological process, for example. So learning has always happened. Teaching has always happened as well. So for the longest period of time in history of mankind, you can see evidence of teaching. You can see evidence of mentoring. Even schools have existed for a very, very long time. Schools meaning any place where people would gather and learn um, uh, has existed for a very long time. Even universities existed. Actually, Indian universities, some of them existed from almost 5th and 6th century AD, which means that they have existed for such a long time that even the British schooling was not yet there. And yet, what is new is education, or let's say the education system. The education system, meaning a centralized system with an agenda for an entire large number of people, is fairly recent. It is recent. By recent, I mean about 300, 400 years old. It is recent in terms of how long mankind has existed. So when we look at the education system, or this education model of centralized teaching, of centralized knowledge sharing, and an agenda for industry, it comes from the industrial revolution of the 17th century in Europe, right? So what the Europeans at that time were going through was this massive industrial revolution, where factories were popping up, and they were the focus was entirely on creating large workforces in order to work these factories, in order to make sure that there is enough labor available. Now, that was difficult to do with a natural population where people had different kinds of learning, different kinds of schooling, different kinds of methods, and no centralized structure. And so the first of these sort of European schools were created basically so that people who are very, very young can be taken in and let's say molded over a period of 15, 20 years to actually much lesser than that, to start wanting to go to a factory to work, want to go to a company and become an employee. And so they created a system which was very industrial in nature. The output that they wanted was basically an economic output and not a learning or intellectual output. That came a bit later. A bit more thinking was required, where aspects of life started being considered as an educational outcome, but much later, much later, even later than when this model came to India. So, of course, many of you, or at least some of you, might have heard of Macaulay, this sort of villainous guy from the East India Company, or who briefly consulted with them, made this note about what he understood and saw about Indian education, right? And so he felt that, of course, our traditional formats of learning, sharing knowledge, and schooling were so inferior that if you put together all of the learning and literature of India, it would still not be able to be substantial enough to equate with a small primary grade textbook. So he was of that opinion, and he wrote this Minutes of Macaulay, and he basically said that what India needs is a new class of people who are not exactly Indians, who are different from the sort of emotional, passionate Indian, who are civilized, who are very willing to go through, to be ordered and instructed, and very willing to feel that they are the sort of new elite class that is more British in nature, thinks like a Brit, talks like a Brit, walks like a Brit. And so that was the sort of the misassumption here should not be that he created the education system in India. That's not true. That he basically is an example of the thought process of that time, right? So what kind of thinking were these people going through at that time when they were thinking of education in India? He's basically the sort of example of that. Now, also understand that there was no British government in India for a long time. There was just a company. The colonization actually started out as an economic corporate activity, if you want to think about it like that, as opposed to a governmental outreach or takeover. So it was actually companies that went, attacked places, or made negotiations and took over nations. East India Company for our case, and much later it is actually the sort of a government was established. There was a governmental control. So when we talk about the schooling system, it comes even as early as when the company was still working as a company in India, and not necessarily as the British government in India. So that's where we start, right? That's where our the origin of the schools that we see today begins. Now, I have another question before we move on. But before that, let me answer some of the or look at some of the answers you've given. Some have mentioned Gurukuls and religious education. Yes, so Gurukuls and religious education, and from the temples, and even after the the Mughals came to India, the advent of madrasas, you could say that these were sort of uh, generated or created within the Indian subcontinent. And so it was not a sort of a hostile takeover per se, but rather, the evolution of education that was happening within the subcontinent. However, it is different from the schools that we see today. So there was all of this education for many, many years evolved. And then at some point, the Brits just stopped them and said, no, from now education will be going to our kind of school, because whatever you have or whatever you call education and learning is incomparable to our scientific thought process and rationalism. So so the schools that you see today are not really are not really connected that much with gurukuls and temple education. They were stopped, and then an entirely new process began. Was there anything? Yeah, religious and caste are two main reasons. Yes, again, I would say that was before the British education. Caste somehow continued to, and still continues in many ways, to intertwine itself with education in many parts of India. However, that is not the reason for, well, let's say not entirely the reason for the modern Indian schooling. However, it played a role. For example, it's the Brahmins who received even the first British education was affordable and possible for the Brahmins of the society, and not the other castes or other classes. So yes, it does play a role, not only in India, in all parts of the world where it starts with a specific group of people, but it is not entirely the reason for this system. All right, so I'll ask another question, which is pertinent to what's happening here, right? Now think like the sort of 16th, 17th century Britain. Think about okay, so you've gone out. You've gone out and you've tried. You've sort of captured a lot of land, and you are still a very small country, a minority in every colony, right? The Brits here, very few compared to the Indian population in those times, and the same in all the other countries that they were occupying. So you have taken control. Now, how are you going to sustain control? How are you going to keep fighting? Are you going to keep using violence as a method to control people? What are you going to do to dominate the world? What is your answer? What would you do? Think like a little villain for a bit, and let's see what you write. So go on, put it in the comments. What would you do? Divide and rule. Just try to explain it a bit, right? Divide and rule is actually a sort of a different kind of political policy they use, but try to explain it. Provide livelihood. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Dividing the population among the Hindus and Muslims in early India and among the various kingdoms to help gain the supremacy.
That was one of the things they did.
Yeah.
Right? But they did
What will you do?
Yeah,
here?
what would you do? They did something more subtle than that. Epistemological conquest was what the Brits used to do, and that is the policy I would use to ensure that domination seems justifiable. Perfectly right. Go on, go on. Try to explain that a little bit. Try to write a couple more sentences. Marry the princesses of all neighboring lands is a comment.
I just read that comment.
You have to understand how they looked at Indians. They didn't look at Indians as equal human beings. That is something very important to understand.
Yes.
A common language, maybe, find a common ground. Okay, yeah. What was the purpose of this language? Do they want to create equality between them and the Indians? What was the reason to find common ground or common language? To feed their economic interests. Mhm. Ultimately, the goal remains always money.
Yes.
All right, 2 more minutes. Well, being an educator, I will try to create perspective about among child to be human, not to discriminate. Yeah, but you have to think like them, right? You have to think like how they thought at that time, trying to dominate a country that does not have, that does not really love them.
There is no unity.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of people on this call. I would really love to for you to give it a shot. It's okay. Just this is not a question of what they actually did. It's a question what you would do or what you would try. It's a thought question as opposed to
Yeah.
anything else.
So it is like vague answers you can give for this
Yeah,
question. And it
completely
can
great.
be anything. There are n number of possibilities.
Hmm.
So just give it a shot.
Try to convince people that this is what God intended. That is a very good answer. Although see, you would do that. You try to convince that this is what God intended. If you want somebody of a higher power to say that, what you are doing is right, and that happens generally between equals, right? So if you and the other person are equal, then you try to get the help of God to come to your side to add some leverage. But here, that's not the case. They don't think of themselves and Indians as equals.
To
To increase the
increase
armed
army
forces in other
force.
countries. Increasing the armed forces is a complicated idea. One of the reasons why, um, uh, you know, uh, it, it, they can't increase any British forces. That their country is small. The number of people they have is very little. So ultimately, if they want an armed force, which they actually did, is Indian armed forces that listen to them. The
So
workers were
one
very,
one
yeah.
person is saying on Facebook, give them livelihood by buying their products.
Unfortunately, I mean, they did buy materials from them and
Yeah.
raw materials, especially. However, I wouldn't call it products because they were actually selling products. That was one of the reasons to come to India,
Yeah.
was that Europe did not have a market like India, right?
Yes.
Europe just did not have anything that was as big as the Indian subcontinent where they could sell. So the real motive was to sell, not to buy.
Yeah. Spreading my own ideas to the people, creating my own policies, and reforming the education system in order to communicate with the people more efficiently so that I can utilize the local resources to my benefit, but at the same time, people that my policies are better than others.
Mhm, mhm.
To
Okay,
give a purpose to the people and in turn drive some sort of gain from it.
this is lovely. I think, guys, you have some very good hints here. So you're very close. So the the way the British had to think about this was clearly that brute strength is not going to work, right? You can't fight your way all the time to keep the country in control and to keep making business. You need to make them believe that you are good for them, right? You need to, before that, they actually started believing themselves that they are very important for the cultural, economic, and moral, especially moral growth of India. They actually started thinking like that. They started looking at, said they'd already been there in India for about 100 years. Things were already looking pretty bad. And then they looked around, oh my God, this country is so poor, they need our help, right? Whereas they came to India, first of all, because the country was very rich. It wasn't poor. They ended up making it a pretty bad situation, and then they felt their moral responsibility to help out. And this sort of can be seen in many documents, including Macaulay's, where it is very clearly stated that they feel, oh, these uncivilized indigenous people need our education so that they might live a fulfilling life like us people in Britain. So yeah, so common language is, of course, was essential. I see that that's also part of many of the comments. But first, let's understand that mindset. The mindset was sort of like a very paternalistic mindset, like I need to save my children here, otherwise they will go astray. And they started thinking that the Indian people are unhappy, and that their understanding of happiness comes from the sort of very 17th, 18th century concept of happiness, of being very well organized, good conduct, good governance, and being a civil person. It did not talk about happiness as actually what was discussed in Indian literature much before they came, as a pursuit of life, as the way you live. No, their concept of happiness was more or less of how well you are organized, how well you are governed, and how how many times you don't ask questions and don't deviate from the common cause. So that's how they started thinking, and of course they needed part of the Indian population to help them control the rest of India, right? Kind of like how they needed an army of Indians to ultimately be the Indian, the British Indian Army, and fight for them in the wars in the Second World War, because they themselves could not, just by themselves, they just did not have enough people. So in the same way, they needed within the country an army or a class of new citizen that was in favor of them, right? And who better than to go towards the Brahmins, who were already at the higher stature in society, and offer to them so-called British education, and start saying that, hey, if you went through this, you are closer to us than your compatriots in your country, these poor people who are illiterate, uncivilized, when people started going through this education, these schools that they were bringing to India, creating in India, this sort of very small percentage, by the time they would graduate, it would be instilled in their mind that now they are better than the rest, that they are they are more evolved, they're almost a different species than the rest of their countrymen. They're actually British in nature, and they are the new sort of colonial class. And if you see that, that reflected very strongly in even the freedom movement and struggle, where ultimately the political ruling classes that emerged were very high caste, upper caste Brahmins, were very the people who had gone through this kind of education, and of course they wanted. They had a nationalist fervor. They thought, no, this country should be ours. But basically, they replaced the colonists, the elite British, and became the new elite themselves. And so even now, you see that that flavor has existed. You see that somebody who's gone through school thinks that somebody who hasn't gone through school as an inferior person. Almost like an insult. He would actually say to this person, oh my God, you are, yeah, an animal. So, you're not treated with respect because because you are educated, have entered the high class, the elite of the country, and we have maintained that somehow. So that is the argument to make here, that yes, the British brought the system, and it was not. Please understand that it is not just the schooling system that educated people. People were educated through a lot of means, through how the postal department worked, how the army worked, how the railway services worked, through how their politics and policies work. All of this together was education for the Indians, was making them believe that they need the British to live a good life, to live a life of their kind of happiness. And then they brought up this new class of people who think like that, who think like them. However, this new class of people still had a group of people who were not entirely in agreement. They wanted the country to be free from British rule. And so they went ahead through the freedom struggle, actually challenged a lot of these educational parameters, like the politics and the policies. They changed, the various departments and structures and companies that ran. They changed a lot of things, except the education system, right? They did not actually, while they were criticizing of the British understanding of Indian people, they were critiquing that, they were challenging that. However, they agreed somehow with the educational model that one person called the teacher should teach all these other people. Think about it again, which is such a paternalistic behavior, that you believe that there is an elite class of people, and only those people have the moral responsibility to teach other people who are uncivilized and uneducated. Which was, this sort of distinction was very strongly made. And then even after they left, our own politics and our own leaders continued with that structure, because they also believe that, they also came through the same education, and they believe that yes, a few awakened, enlightened people must teach everybody else, so that they can be awakened and enlightened too, and they can become a part of the new middle class, and live this sort of organized life. And so, while there were some criticisms, and some push for revival of Indian culture, there was very little push for the revival of Indian education, or even thinking about the old Indian education, and how that was not entirely completely wrong. It had some things bad about them, but certainly some things good about them as well. But that notion could not come, even though, for example, people like Gandhi. So Gandhi strongly critiqued it, and said that, yeah, we can't have such an education system that the British have left behind, because it continues to make us servile in nature. And instead of the British, now we will become servile to the new elite class in India. And however, while people listened to Gandhi a lot in his political ideologies, they did not listen to him, and sort of ignored him on his educational ideologies. Oh, there's a question. Was the British education system passively supporting the caste system? If not, why did the British caste system persist? Is it that the British education system was not influential enough? So the British education system, and it is very common that this has happened in many other countries. Very recently, I read a lot about Rwanda, where they use the tribal system to and offered education in a certain specific way. Not only education, all sorts of policies start being organized around benefiting a small group of people who can rise up above the rest and sort of become your allies. So while they did not actively want to support probably the caste system, or did not actively say that, but they used it to work with a small group of people who could control the large group of people. And the reason why I think the caste system persists is because education by itself is not designed in a way to take it out, to eradicate it. The way education system is designed is to ignore things, not to solve them. It says that, okay, your economic gain is your ultimate achievement, not a better life, not an equalist life. Philosophy has no space in education, in British education. And even you must think about this as well, that while they introduced subjects like science and philosophy and math and a lot of things that you would think would make a person intellectual, it was based on ultimately a thought of making people sort of follow the ideologies as opposed to think or create new ones. Just a thought, didn't exposure to external influence free us from many superstitious beliefs and practices? Yeah, but there are probably countries who did not have to go through colonization. Take British England, for example. They had superstitions and they did not have after a point. So development happens even without being colonized. So exposure would have happened anyway, right? You would globalization or meeting other countries with the advent of technology would have happened anyway. It did not need to create a slave class, and it did not need for a country to become so poor because of such kind of basically attack. So yeah, so when we look at the moment India got independence, there was no real interest in changing or rethinking the educational model. The interest was completely on expanding it, making it bigger, and so more and more and more of the same kind of schools were created without thinking really of what these schools are supposed to do, what is it that Indians as a people need, what is it that communities need. And so what we have now is basically an almost unchallenged system, a schooling system, and you could even say a higher education system that is almost unchallenged. And when we say about, how can the system become in a way that it benefits Indian people, we cannot think outside the school. We cannot think outside anything that could be different from what a school looks like, or what a university or a middle education space looks like. It's very hard to look outside that or to imagine outside that, because it's kind of like somebody came and programmed a bunch of robots, like 10 robots, and then made those robots program 10 more robots, and then those robots program 10 more robots. Now, even after the programmer has died, our programming restricts us to look to look beyond what we have been given. And so no major overhaul has happened in terms of reimagining a classroom or reimagining a school. We still have pretty much what existed 100 years back, except the color of the photographs have changed. So the damage is so big that not only we have been forced to keep an education system, but it is that big that we are unable to imagine something different from it, or create something new, because we have been part of the same education system, and it has been sort of blinding us. It is so true. It is deeply rooted that we cannot think. Yes, we have to understand our own conditioning, which prevents us from thinking beyond, from looking at education in a different way. And it's not just India, mind you. You can go to any country that was colonized, and you'll find some sort of a similar story where educational evolution was always happening. There was no centralized educational agenda. It did not have to be there, because communities were taking care of education themselves, right? Learning was always happening. They found their own ways. However, then a forced system was put in place, mostly by colonizers or companies, and then it became, it lasted for so long that people simply could no longer imagine a different method, and that's the world we are currently living in. Liz says, how do we break this system on a mass scale? Amazing question, Liz. Actually, that is the question I'm going to ask people to think about, because today we are role playing. We are trying to think like people in different positions. We thought like the British. Now we have to think like the people of this country who want to make a change and who want to actually challenge this sort of mass programming system, which in my opinion is almost a crime, and there is no criminal. The education system is almost a crime against children, taking away the capacity to think. However, the criminals have long gone, and we ourselves are perpetuating that crime going forward. So I'll come back to that question. I'll ask everybody what they think about it as well. There's another big question. So since the few teachers teach all model is prevalent in most countries and not only in colonized ones, would this model of education have been, like you spoke of earlier, a biological development? No. So while colonization did not reach everywhere, industrialization did. So the idea of creating workers did reach a lot of the other countries. So in those days, I mean, basically either there was a country that was going to colonize or going to be colonized or was going to get ignored because there was no sort of economic benefit from it. So that's where the sort of world lied. And so the people either benefiting from colonization or losing from colonization were sort of the two big classes. And those who were benefiting from colonization were benefiting it in industrial terms. And so they also absorbed the same school system. However, you can see that countries that were not colonized have still managed to change or modify that same school system a little bit more than countries that were colonized, right? So I downloaded a bunch of pictures once from some of the Western countries and from India, a couple of decades back, of what the school looked like, and they sort of looked similar, right? Benches all one behind each other, guys on one side, girls on one side, or higher caste and lower caste, of black people and white people separated. And then a teacher in the front with a textbook and a ruler or something to hit with. However, now fast forward to like late 2010s, if you look at the pictures again, the classrooms in America and Finland have gone through some transformation, but the classrooms in India haven't as much. Not the ones that are, I mean, of course, there might be those 5% schools that are very different, very, modern in nature, but not the majority of classrooms. 95% remain pretty much what was there from 5 decades back. So yeah, so you said, did it emerge and evolve naturally, or did it become normalized in all countries due to the superpower that the British were? Yes, I mean, you were either absorbing it or you were being forced, right? So I think I've answered that. What can be done to change it? I'll talk about it. Does expansion in basic literacy require such institutional education? Absolutely not. I honestly believe that that is not the case. See, when the Brits came, they redefined what it meant to be literate. They redefined what it meant to be educated, right?
Yes.
Before that, sorry, is that right? So before that, there was not so much of a concept to separate people like that. But you could have literacy, numeracy, and those are literally the lowest standards of learning. The much higher standards were being achieved, even if for small groups of people. Much higher standards of reflecting on life, on introspecting, on thinking about what are the better ways of living life, on also thinking, for example, Gandhi's method was actually very industrious, but a different kind of economic growth, not the kind that the Europeans wanted us to believe. So there was a lot of, there are a lot of possibilities actually to grow even economically and live a happy life and think about life than the way we have been taught through the schooling system, because that's just one method, and many methods have existed before that. We just have no access to them, or difficult access to them today. Why didn't people think of reforming the education back then? Was it because we couldn't think of a better system? Well, partly yes. So partly some people could, but then the others, especially the political class, were interested in the politics and reforming politics and not reforming education, because they didn't think of education as a political tool. They didn't think of schools as a political tool that the British had already used, and they could not think that, oh yeah, we need to change that. No matter how many politics and policies you will change, if you don't change the education system, people will behave in the same way, even if better rights and better laws are accessible to them. So this was one of the things, and of course they came from the same system. There are lots of notes where you can see that they actually agreed with the British format of education. They did, and including people who were at the very top of the Indian government once the independence was achieved.
So, Abhijit, there are so many people asking on Facebook also, how can we do something for this, and what is their role in this thing?
Good. I will just okay. Yeah, I think this is a good time to think about that.
Yeah.
Uh, there is a question from Manasvi though about throwing some light on education system before the British.
Yes.
Um, the short, I will not go into details because that needs another 2 hours. But the short answer is there was no education system, right? There was
Yes.
no centralized educational model for everybody with the same agenda. And that is why many models, many thought processes, many ideas existed simultaneously in this country, right? And in all other countries, in many, many other places. So all it will take is reading. Read about the universities. I really love how these universities existed before a schooling structure, a centralized schooling structure existed through a process of internships and mentorship, which are new words, but actually happened a couple of centuries back as well. So I will not get into the details, but there is a lot to read about schooling structures, even madrasas who underwent a lot of transformation afterwards, but initially had a lot of scientific and religious thought. Tibetan temples were and universities that were created in Bihar, which were the origin point of philosophical thought processes and design, like Buddhism, right? So a lot of Buddhist texts and treatises were written in universities back then. Gurukuls were a method too, but they were also not all the same. There was a lot of differences and distinctions. You will find that there's a lot of gap of documentation in this because, for the last, let's say, 300 years, we have not been interested in it. We have not had the chance to document this, and this is now a lot old. This information is hard to find. So you'll find that there's a lot of missing pieces, a lot of missing documents, things that nobody knows where they are, and you can't get a complete picture. But you will certainly understand that there was no one system; there were so many different ones.
Yeah. So
Okay.
Abhijit, yeah. So Abhijit, to add your topic, Hiram sir from CC Finland, he's saying infrastructural classrooms will change only after teachers qualified. As of today, the teacher education is pathetic here.
Yes, Hiram, you are completely right. Um, and even that was a design. It's not an accident. The reason why teachers earlier had a very high role in society in the pre-colonial period.
Yeah.
Teachers were basically they had full freedom to teach how they want. They could work with one student in a different way, another student in a different way, and they were very well paid, not only in terms of money but in terms of resources. Their food was taken care of for a lifetime, and they were actually doing very well. Now, when the British created their schooling system and looked at the teaching model, they turned them into clerical jobs. They made them underpaid. They started thinking, especially of school teachers, especially even in that of primary school teachers, as people who are doing a job that anybody can do, right? Which is not
Yeah.
true. That was not the case, and it is certainly not the case today either. But you can see that when we look at people getting jobs into the teaching world, it seems to be a sort of last preference that anybody can get into if you get some certificates. And so that changed the conversation around the teaching job itself, and it changed teachers from being required to be intellectual, thinking, working off their feet, crafting education for students. It turned them into delivery mechanisms. They're basically the Swiggy equivalent of then that all the content and processes would be designed centrally by central agencies who are elites, who are better, who know everything, and then teachers' job is to take it and pass it on, and that's it. no freedom of expression, no space to rethink. And on top of that, because they thought that this job is so easy, they can do other jobs as well. In some cases, they even thought of teachers becoming, they even made them deliver post. They still, even now, today, teachers are responsible for election voting work at schools. And tons of other things were pushed on teachers because they were they were now changed into the lowest form of work. There's evidence of them being paid even less than manual laborers in the colonial India. So once that bottom line was created about what this teaching job is, it made it very difficult over time, and it continues to be today, to change that thought process around teaching. Right, very few countries even now actually think of teachers in a different way, and pay them wages on par with the top intellectuals in their country. So this is a big damage. This is
Yes.
a damage of over 2 centuries.
Yeah. So I think now that question, how you can contribute and how you can change.
All right. Hey, how much time do we have? Technically 3 minutes, yeah? But
Yeah, but
can we
we
have
can
some?
like maybe exceed for some 10 minutes, but not more
Okay,
than
good.
that because we have another session after this.
10 minutes, I promise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, guys. Um, this is the chance, yeah? So let's now, right now, you know the history, at least to some extent. You know the injustice, that how unfair it is to have a schooling system like this, to both the students and the teachers and the parents and the country and our brains, basically. So you tell me, what are some methods you suggest? I will talk about the method I have worked on for the last 6 years, towards the end, maybe for a minute or two. But I would really love to listen to you guys. How do you think this can be challenged? How do you think that we could really imagine something that is a new learning model, a new learning system, or maybe not even a system at all, and yet is very different and completely different. That doesn't look anything like a school, maybe, or maybe it does look a little bit like the school, but the idea is not dependent on the school. So I think that's the answer in general to this question. But specifically, what would you do, right? What would you do if you have all the power to do anything you want? Now, what would you do to change this? Liz Johnson, non-cooperation with factory schooling on a mass scale, walking out of the system. Bingo. That's really good, right? We are seeing such amazing examples. This is the century of not keeping quiet, right? So we are seeing such amazing examples of people walking out and saying that, no, this doesn't work for us anymore. You cannot force us to follow a certain way of life anymore. And so if that is possible, certainly it is possible to not cooperate with factory schooling. However, understand that the marketing of factory schooling is about 250 years for India, right? Breaking that marketing, people actually believe that sending their kid to school is a good idea. So to challenge that is certainly a difficult task, but walking out is certainly one way. It will create a demand for creating a new method, a new system. So that is one side, creating a demand for a better model, a different model, a model that works for us in our different contexts. So let's keep that as one segment. Let's hear some more. Inclination towards training and vocational based learning rather than the bookish one. Yes, that is. I mean, Gandhi's method was basically inclined towards that. Nai Talim was head, heart, hand, to help Indians create economies from what India has to offer, as opposed to copy economies of the rest of the world. So become unique in that way, and think about what you can do as opposed to just what you can learn. But of course, there has to be, India is one of the biggest examples of where vocational training has failed. And now some revival work is happening, Odisha and some other places. But in the last few decades, we saw ITI not work out for the masses, and became a secondary or third grade educational process, not a first grade one. Whereas if you look at Germany, it succeeded there, where it became a first grade process, vocational training. But at the same time, one side is the skills, but then the other side is the understanding of life itself. So life skills, like nobody at school teaches us how to do our taxes. Yes, very specific things. Again, this is all still on the skills side, but good. So we got two segments now. One is on the protest side. Okay, do not cooperate and walk out. Then there is a reformation on the skills side. Think about skills again. Rethink about what does it mean for us. Guys, let's hear some more. Let's hear some more. See, if you're struggling, that is basically the evidence of what I have been saying, that it is very difficult for us to imagine because of our own programming. It is really difficult. And because what have we seen? We have only seen this one format all our lives. Freedom of choice. Yes, choice is a very central aspect. In fact, if you look at the oldest universities that existed in India, were very choice-based and very much based also on skills and thought, but basically somebody driving himself or herself through, a sequence of choices that they were making, and then reaching a point where they are so good that the university accepts them, the king patron becomes their patron, and they don't have to worry for the rest of their life. So it has, again, something that is not entirely new. It has existed before, but is completely lost from the current discussion on education from India. Choice is yet another segment to redefine education as in a way that is human, thinks of children and people as complete human beings who are capable of making choices, and not enforces decisions on them. Experience-based self-learning. Yes, absolutely. Instead of having centralized education, we can have personalized mentors to guide students. Yes, self-learning, innovation. See, if you look deeply, the only thing that the central education system does is, one, that it takes all the money from people to the very top, and then starts distributing again to the very bottom, right? Instead, where before people and schooling had direct money relationship or direct resource relationship, they gave directly to the school, and the school responded with quality learning. Instead, now there's a third party, which is the central bodies. They take all this money to the top and bring all this money to the bottom. And in between, because the very system exists, a lot of money is lost because so many people have to be paid, right? So many people are working in that space. So many inspectors and supervisors and deputy supervisors and whatnot, district education. And mind you, these are bureaucrats. They are not educators. So basically, all the power of education lies in the hands of people who are not even educators, not even students. They have nothing to do with education. They're just bureaucrats. So, so it's designed to be faulty, basically, and we have to rethink how that centralized system can be removed. Or if you want a centralized system, like in Finland, they have an interesting method where the centralized model only creates a framework but gives teachers, students, and that township to discuss what is important for them and how the delivery should happen. So that's sort of a partial method. We need to create a vertical path of opportunities for those who want to walk out of the system. Yes, thank you. This will help free the insecurity and fear associated with walkouts. Absolutely, create parallel systems, right? The schooling system is there. You create something alternative to it, so that a lot of people who are, a lot of parents have told me that, hey, you know what? If I take my kid out of the school, which I want to, where will my kid go, right? And you should have an answer for that. So we need other systems to exist, because while there will be some brave people who will walk out, others will need an alternative. So we have to definitely think of alternatives. And personally, that is my way of working, whereas my friends and other people, they're working in all the other segments as well. Any more suggestions?
What do we actually want out of our education?
Yes. So that, in my opinion, the question is so right, but the answer is not exactly what we want, but who should we ask this question, right?
Yeah.
So this question of what we want from education is currently being answered by only a couple of people who form the who are the designers of education for the whole country, right? Whereas this question should be asked to learners, to people who will benefit from education, right? What do you want out of education? And that answer keeps changing with time, and so that power should somehow be in the hands of the people themselves. So this question, very important. Even more important is how and who are we asking this question to. We need to convince people that only specific fields are not career options. Indian engineering is the minimum default career option. Yes, yes, absolutely. That is the essence of what industrial education looks like, right? When you have a schooling system or an education system that responds to the needs of the industry as opposed to responding to the needs of the people, that's what you get. You get a schooling system that is always running behind industry, trying to go towards whatever is generating the most amount of money, which is ridiculous, and which is why at some point it always fails, because one thing will generate money for some period of time, and then it will stop doing that, and then you have to run behind something. Instead, it should be the students who then grow up to influence industry, and their choices are what define the industry, not the other way around. So that is one of the problems of industrial education that we currently have. Although, Abhijit, can these reforms be made with the amount of pressure that our country faces from politicians and third parties? Is this too far-fetched? See, this feeling that we are getting, and I get this too, this nervousness that it's too big a goal, is a feeling that is not only in our heads, it has been put in the minds of our parents and our grandparents for many generations, that a system is not something you can change because you are nobody, right? There are big politicians and elite people and all of these guys who are who have so much power, and only they can do something. Absolutely not. I think it is not far-fetched. I think that the only thing that is a struggle is believing in ourselves, and as long as we do that, and I see people doing that, even the numbers are small, but they are doing it. The system, to change a big system does not mean to create another big system. To change a big system may be as small as creating a small learning space in your village, in your city, for just 50 people. You change it for those 50 people, then the influence goes on to a lot more people, and the demand for a change increases. So it is not far-fetched. It is not something individuals can't do. We need to give this power to the people of the community. Absolutely, 100%, right? 100%. We need a huge number of small learning spaces for India. Exactly. That is what happened before. That is what created the diversity of learning spaces, and we have to think about that again. That, hey, let communities have their own learning spaces that they decide, they run, they manage, and our job probably is to help them, not to tell them what they should learn, but to help them in what they want to learn, and support them with whatever resources they need. All right, I think I'm at the end of my thing.
Yes, so there were so many questions and a very interesting session. So, guys, I would like to tell you all that we have uploaded few documents for you, few reading material for you under the folder. So please check that folder and those documents. So yes, thank you so much, Abhijit, for this wonderful session. And people who have any other questions, you can tell us, and we can share those questions with Abhijit, and he will answer them. It is really awesome that a person who is not from like a historic background, and then he is talking about history of education with the people. So you are actually bringing that history to common people. So that was really amazing. And now we have one session after this. It is at 5:30 p.m. So whoever is attending this session, that session is for documentation of your work. And Tejal, who is our lead researcher, she is gonna guide you throughout the process. So please attend that session. And now I want to ask you one question, like everyone, why did we listen and understand all this history of education? Why did we do that today? So you have to think about it. And you have one whole day. Tomorrow we will be having one session with Sharwari. It is about policy in education. So I think that will be a continue part, second part of this conversation. So that time you have to answer that session, that this question. So think about it. And I'll tell you, tomorrow we have three sessions because it is a Sunday. First one is cognitive psychology. It is from 4 to 5. Then mass education program with Vivek sir. It is 5:30 to 6:30. And then education policy in action with Sharwari from 7 to 8. So let's take a leave now. Thank you, Abhijit. And whatever questions we get from the participants, we will share them with you. And we are really looking forward to have you with us in throughout this journey. So, is there anything which you would like to share with people, like any material or names of movies or anything like that? Then please let us know. Then we will share that stuff with people here.
Super. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Thank you.
I had a lovely time.
Yes, thank you so much. It was fun, like listening to you. Yeah,
All right. Great.
yeah.
Bye, guys. Thank you so much.
Yes, yes. Bye bye. See you all at 5:30, and we are not doing live of that session on Facebook. So please attend here on Zoom. Yeah. Bye.